The structure is that I will provide an introduction and then hand over to my esteemed colleague Richard Sully, who will explain why this research is important in a broader context. We'll then hand over to Sol Brown and the academic team to talk through the work, and I'll try and curate some questions and comments at the end. If you have questions throughout, please feel free to post those on the chat. So I'm assuming you can still see my slides. So what I wanted to talk through on behalf of the university is that the Office for Data Analytics is part of a real-world partnership, as part of the Made Together programme, which is the University of Sheffield working with organisations and individuals across South Yorkshire. It's a major initiative for the university, has a dedicated team of staff and a clear brief to do four things: make the region healthier, greener, more vibrant and innovative for all. And data is clearly data analytics, and data is a key part of that. So what is the ODA pilot and why are we doing it? Well, it's about better data, better evidence and better decisions. Rather than reading off all of the bullet points, what I want to say is that there's a lot of data initiatives going on in South Yorkshire, and the Office for Data Analytics is one way of knitting some of those together, but also looking at how policy officers, those working in the public sector, private sector and voluntary sector can use data and expertise from the University of Sheffield and the Sheffield Hallam University as well. And what we're looking to do at this stage is establish better data evidence and decision making around a local and national policy need. So a national policy need perhaps best articulated by the government through their levelling up agenda. But locally, we have always had a long-standing requirement for better insight and intelligence. And the pilot programme that we've been undergoing is a way to illustrate the benefits of better data evidence and decision making by exploring data sharing across South Yorkshire, looking at enhanced analytics and specialist insights to unlock deeper understanding, improve decision making and support partners in a variety of different ways. And the Office for Data Analytics, or ODA, had a series of demonstrator projects, as you've perhaps listened in this week around and last week around innovation, household finance, financial resilience, digital poverty, and to data around hydrogen conversion. What the outputs are around visualizations, reports, policy briefings, webinars, as well as some other communication material. There is also a pilot website which we'll post, and that has some of the information on it, and is starting to be quite mature. But we're also undertaking a series of consultation exercises and exploring what a permanent service could look like. So highlighting the potential for better analytics and data sharing, consulting on how that could work going forward, and building that case. It's at this point I will hand over to the meat and the drink of the webinar to Richard Sully, who will explain a little bit more about hydrogen and why this is important.
I don't know whether I'm the meat or the drink in that, John, but I'll take either, I think. So yeah, the reason this piece of research is interesting to us, I guess, you know, we got to boil it down. South Yorkshire is unique in some of its challenges. Every region will tell you that they're unique, but I think we are in our location, our mix of industries. And so we need to look, when we're looking at decarbonisation of South Yorkshire, we need to look for innovation in how we deal with that. So to give you some stats, because we all like stats, industrial use of natural gas represents about 7.5% of the total carbon emissions of the region. So it's significant. And the industries that use that are heavily reliant on it for different reasons. Some it's because it's legacy, that's what they've always done. Some it's a process requirement to burn natural gas. Some it's it's a heat requirement to generate the level of heat. The most appropriate way to do that is to burn natural gas. And some have huge capital investments in the equipment that they've got that use that. Got a bit of an echo from somebody. I'll try again. So how we tackle that is important. Now, in other areas of the country, if you look to the east and west coast, if you look to the northeast, there is a burgeoning hydrogen industry based around the fact that they have access to North Sea oil and gas for blue hydrogen, or they have access to renewables from offshore wind. They have very high density of industrial users. So there's probably going to be, in the not too distant future, a hydrogen industry there satisfying those needs. Where we are, we're landlocked and we don't have the density of industry to support that kind of work as yet. We may at some point in the future get a pipe of hydrogen from one of the coasts to satisfy our requirements, but that is not likely to be in the time we need to meet our net zero ambitions. So what we need to do is look at alternatives, and this piece of research starts the conversation on that, really. It looks at where hydrogen could be used, what industries could use it. It looks geospatially at this to see if there are obvious clusters, but then it starts to move on to combine other data sets to say, well, where could we be generating hydrogen? If we were to create green hydrogen hubs, where could they be located? Part of that is, where can they be co-located with people that use it? But as well, where could we be generating the renewable energy that we need to provide electricity for that generation? Where are there grid constraints that prevent that happening? And this, it doesn't provide all the answers, but it starts that conversation. It starts us understanding the sort of what if and the potential for hydrogen in the region. What we can then use that is, if we're talking to BEIS about potentially funding pilot projects, we can use this kind of information. But I hope also that potential users can look at it and say, well, maybe we didn't realize who the other people locally are who we could potentially partner with and cluster with. Or there could be private sector organizations who want to come in and build infrastructure to support those industries can look at this kind of data. So it's kind of a different way of thinking for us to commission pieces of research like this and then to publish the data and say, you outside of this, these four walls can go away and do what you like with it and try and come up with innovative solutions based on it. So I'll shut up now and let Solo actually know something about this subject to come on and talk you.
It's always dangerous when someone says that you know something about something. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm Sol Brown. I am Professor of Process and Energy Systems at the University of Sheffield. And as Richard kind of said, and John said, that what we wanted to do as part of this project was put together kind of an initial data set of the hydrogen generation, conversion and use capacity within the South Yorkshire region, as well as looking at some of the potential grid constraints, not only for hydrogen, but also for other kind of parts of the decarbonisation chain. So I'll probably take a little bit under 25 minutes and hopefully we'll generate lots of questions, because I think that's what this data set is really about. So background, I was going to go a little bit through why we're interested in hydrogen. I think that's sort of key to understand. And essentially, as part of the UK's net zero policy, we're going to have to decarbonise every part of the economy, including industry, power, everything. And as part of that, we're going to have to increase the number of the amount of renewables, the deployment of and reduction of the amount of fossil fuels, and the way that we use kind of agriculture and land use. So all of these aspects come in. And the cool thing about hydrogen is it impacts all of these. So hydrogen sort of sits in the middle of the net zero strategy as put forward by the UK government. The decarbonisation itself is not short of policy from central government. So there are a range of policy documents out there at the moment, from heat and buildings, decarbonisation of transport, the power industry and industrial decarbonisation. So all of these are really interesting documents to have a look through. But essentially, as part of all of them, hydrogen sits as an option. So whether it's replacing gas for gas boilers, as an alternative to electrical vehicles, or simply as a means of energy production for the wider network, hydrogen is kind of a core thing. And in itself, we have the hydrogen strategy, which kind of documents where the UK wants to go in terms of production and use of hydrogen. So what does that mean for Sheffield, and why do we care? Well, we've got a reasonably large industrial base. We want to use hydrogen essentially because it decarbonises the use of a fuel, and in lots of sectors, as you can see in the figure on the right here, which comes from DEFRA, you can use it as a replacement for things like for natural gas, or where you'd use a carbonaceous fuel. Industry itself produces about 16% of the UK's emissions as of 2018. I'm sure that's updated. And if you're using natural gas, then you're producing about 0.5 kilo of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which includes both the production and the burning of the fuel. And at least in use of the hydrogen as a fuel, you're producing zero CO2. So it's kind of CO2 free at the point of use. At the point of production, there may be some CO2 produced based on the color of the hydrogen. And we'll go back a little bit onto the color of hydrogen in a second. There are many colors of hydrogen, and they seem to increase at a rate of knots. But essentially what hydrogen can be is a tool alongside electrification of processes to reduce the amount of CO2 emissions across the economy. So whether it's in steel production or in low carbon vehicles, the use of hydrogen can help us reduce dependency on fossil fuels at the point of energy demand. And we can switch in, and hopefully, if we can move to green hydrogen, we can produce it in the CO2 emission-free way. So the national strategy for hydrogen is long term. What's interesting, actually, as Richard has sort of said, that around the coasts of the UK, there's lots of planned hubs for production of hydrogen. If you look where South Yorkshire is, and my geography is not great, but it's somewhere in that circle, there's no plan for large-scale hydrogen production. And that means that we're dependent on either of the clusters on the east or west coast for the production of electrolytic hydrogen, or with blue hydrogen from Leeds, from the Humber region. So the point here is that a lot of the industrial demand in the region is stuck here, and getting large-scale infrastructure for hydrogen into this region is at least going to be time lagged, but is part of the wider national strategy. So as Richard and John have said, we kind of want to understand how South Yorkshire can participate in this and take advantage of what capacity we do have in the area. Before we move on to that, we do need to go through the different colours of hydrogen. Basically, a colour has been selected for each way that hydrogen can be generated, whether it's through electrolysis. So where electrolysis, so you crack water with an electrical current, is when that's done in tandem with wind, solar, so some kind of green energy, then we call it green hydrogen, through to yellow hydrogen, which is where we perform electrolysis using grid electricity, so where we can't tell where the electricity came from, through to blue hydrogen, which is either from gasification or natural gas reforming, So gasification and natural gas reforming are both old technologies. There's lots of ways that we can make them more efficient, but they're very traditional ways of producing hydrogen. They also produce a lot of CO2. And so in order for these to be low greenhouse gas emitting technologies, we need to add carbon capture and storage or utilization to them. So they don't come in and of themselves, they have to come with this emission reduction technology, which means that the production of hydrogen through blue hydrogen routes is kind of intimately linked with carbon capture systems and their rollout. There are other means of producing hydrogen from gasification of coal, grey hydrogen, which is natural gas reforming but without the CCS, and turquoise hydrogen, which was relatively new to me and means by pyrolysis, which is a technology very related to gasification. Of the three routes which are important for this study, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and biomass gasification are potential options for the South Yorkshire region. So we have biomass power production in the region, we have renewables, and we have access to methane, where we already perform steam methane reformation. So these are all things that play into how the region can produce its own hydrogen. So if we look at, the first thing we did was take a look at where you might be able to produce hydrogen in South Yorkshire. So the first port of call is to look at the renewable planning database. So this is basically a UK central database of where we have deployed renewables, or where people have been awarded permission to, planning permission to site a new generation site. Some of the, as you can see from the different colours, so blue means that there's an operational renewable generator there. There are some abandoned sites or where planning is being refused, and then additional places where we've got planning granted or where planning permission has been submitted. So you can see there's kind of a variation of geographical placement within the region, so it's spatially variant, and it's reasonably well spread across the region. You've kind of, if you were to kind of pick out areas, you might pick some areas in the bottom left hand corner, so around the Sheffield City region, down here between Sheffield and Rotherham, up towards the northwest, and up towards Doncaster in the northeast of the region. But it's reasonably well spread out, and actually the size of these circles on the diagram will kind of show you the size of generation of the particular site, and you can see actually that they're reasonably large bits of kit spread quite well through South Yorkshire. If we then look at the type of operational plants, so if we cut out the ones which will be potentially around in kind of 2030, so things where planning has been permitted, if we cut that all out and look at what's there, and we can see that there's biomass plants, so you expect to see that between Sheffield and Rotherham because of the plants that the CHP plants that are active. And we have the large energy from waste facility in Sheffield itself. We've also got quite a lot of onshore wind, particularly up around Doncaster, and we've got bits and pieces up towards the northeast as well. But what's interesting is there's kind of a variety of different renewable sources here. So there's lots of different stuff going on, and that mix is interesting and important for the ability to deliver different types of hydrogen. Thinking back to the different kind of colours. And if we plot this all on one big graph, on a slightly prettier picture, you can see that the production via green hydrogen, so where it's generated directly from renewable power, is again spread out. So where we're using wind, solar, or another green energy source, then we have that quite spread out throughout the region. But where we have blue hydrogen potential, so that's where we're using gas or biomass through gasification with some CCS, then they're fairly centered around population centers, so up towards Doncaster, around the Sheffield itself, and towards the north of the region. So you can see again that the kind of green hydrogen is well spread, and there's planning for more green hydrogen, potentials for green hydrogen going forward. And the total energy capacity is about 450 gigawatt hours per year. So that's actually quite a substantial amount of hydrogen. From blue hydrogen, mainly via biomass gasification, we're looking at just under 2,000 gigawatt hours of production. Here we've produced these numbers as the maximum amount that we could get from each site. So we've assumed that all of the energy which is produced at a given site goes directly to hydrogen. So this is the maximum amount that we could produce in region at this point. It's more likely in practice that we would want for each site to feed at least some of the electricity into the network in order to decarbonize the region's electricity generation. But for now, we've been looking at just the total potential production of hydrogen. And then if we match that production against demand, so here we've looked at the major emitters in the region. We've selected those that use gas, and we've assumed that we can switch gas use to hydrogen use with a few kind of back of the envelope calculations, so that we can look at the demand. And you can see actually that the demand sites are where you would sort of expect them to be, around Doncaster, around between Sheffield and Rotherham, and then up towards the north of the region. So what's interesting, again, just flipping back between this and the previous slide, that the blue hydrogen production is really well aligned with the potential demand, and that's sort of what you would expect, because the local generation is currently meeting some of their demand, their electricity demand, and actually what we're seeing is that means that the generation of hydrogen and the potential hydrogen demand are also reasonably well aligned. The major hydrogen demands which might form the basis of kind of a local cluster are kind of Liberty Steel, so somewhere up here, Arda Glass, which again currently uses natural gas for its firing its kiln. But you can sort of see from this graph that there are at the beginnings of sort of small regional clusters of demand, which could be used as the basis for regional clusters and planning of hydrogen in the region. So around Sheffield, Rotherham, up near Doncaster, and up towards the north of the region. And again, just to emphasize the point, that sort of fits really well with where we have potential generation of hydrogen. So if we put a big circle around that, because that makes it clear that what we've done is just look on a map and put a circle around it. If we match those production and demand sites, then we have two large clusters. So one around between Sheffield and Rotherham, one up towards Barnsley, and these are largely self-sufficient for hydrogen use based on just the maximal numbers that we've calculated. So these can be self kind of filling just for the industrial use of hydrogen. And then towards the northeast of around Doncaster, there's more geographic spatial scatter of these two things, but you can see also that they form a kind of a more diffuse cluster. So you could produce more of a cluster around here, and that kind of three cluster structure of the region is interesting, comes out through all of these numbers. So the second part of the study was to take this information and to look at how this would fit with some of the electricity use. So if we think back to the definitions of some of the hydrogen production, we saw that we might in some cases want to just directly use electricity from the grid to produce hydrogen. So aligned with the hydrogen work, we've also had to look at the ability of the grid to handle the movement of that electricity. The movement of the electricity through the grid is also of wider significance for the region, because it's a key enabler for all of the other technologies that we might want to deploy. So if we're talking about decarbonising heat, that's not just about hydrogen. It's also about heat pumps, ground source heat pumps. We're not just going to have hydrogen vehicles, we're also going to have electrical vehicles, EVs. And we're going to need to move electricity in a more flexible way from distributed generation, so people's home solar panels and wind, back through the network. And at larger centralized generation facilities, so that we could deploy more onshore wind. And central to all of that is the capacity of the network to hold that power and allow us to connect more into it. So the second part of the study was to go through the electricity grid's ability to handle that. And that means essentially that we created a similar set of pretty maps, which are more colourful in this case. So the Northern Power Grid have a live open data set which you can access. It's quite, if you're a bit of a geek like me, it's quite cool to have a look through. We've kind of broken up this part of the study is a little bit more technical, so there are kind of different levels of the electricity networks that we look at, but essentially what we saw is that there's capacity across the region for the connection of additional generation for the network as it currently is. So if we're looking up towards Doncaster in this region, in the northeast of the city region, there's just over 450 megawatts of power capacity on some of the primary transformers, which means that we've got about 450 megawatts capacity for connection of additional renewables up there. And that sort of aligns again, if you think back with the planning database. So it's clear that the people wanting to deploy wind turbines and solar generation are aware of this, but going forward, planning wise for the region, 450 megawatts is a significant deployment of renewables. We also have headroom around Sheffield of about 550 megawatts, slightly lower down the network. One of the very technical parts of this study was actually deciding what we decided to call parts of the network, which is interesting, but there's no significant headroom on the grid supply point. So further down here towards the bottom of the city region, actually the network is reasonably constrained. So we are looking at connecting more generation to parts of the network which connect to grid supply points slightly outside of the Sheffield City region. But as you can see, and as I've said, we can kind of connect new generation reasonably spread out throughout the entire city region. If we look at the grid availability for demand, then in some places this is slightly more constrained. So why would we be interested in demand? Well, that's because the additional demand would come from people charging their EVs for should they have them. If we're looking at the deployment of heat pumps, whether it be ground source or air source, then they will be driven from the electricity network. And we need enough capacity on the network to allow us to provide that power when it's demanded. So in parts of the region, we're a little bit more constrained. Around the Sheffield City itself and towards Rotherham, but there are parts which are very much unconstrained, which tend to be more rural parts of the region. So medium headroom, so headroom basically means the amount of additional capacity that a substation could take is about 46% of the firm capacity, or about 10 megawatts, which means that if everyone in any of these regions suddenly bought an EV, then we'd probably overload about half of the substations in the region, which is obviously an ongoing planning issue. But this aligns well actually with Northern Power Grid's forecasting themselves. So about 42% of the primaries and some of the bulk supply points are also sort of registered as needing upgrading in order to meet that additional demand. So we have this position where there are kind of clear local clusters of potential hydrogen generation and demand. There's capacity for deployment of additional generation in large parts of the region. And that can be up to about 1 gigawatt of renewables, depending on the part of the network that we want to look at. But there are potential issues around the capacity of the grid to meet additional demand going forward. For example, that based on expanded EV adoption or on heat pumps and their demand profiles. So that's a really quick summary of this data. I would really be grateful for questions. I think that's the point. But I would also like to say thank you to the three guys who actually did the work, Tim, Tom, and Flora, who were really good at digging around for the different databases and pulled together a really good piece of work, which I think is open for everyone to take a look at. And a report alongside this slide deck is available there. It goes into a lot more detail into how the data was produced, so that hopefully that it can be redone. There are obviously specific assumptions that we've made in order to produce high-level estimates, and I think as part of the ongoing discussion with the MCA, we might want to change those, and we wanted to create a flexible data set where that could be part of the discussion. And like I say, thanks to the team, and any questions from the floor would be gratefully received.
Thank you for that, Sol. That was really clear. You presented quite an array of interesting information, which, as we've discussed previously, has different applications in policy or real life to critique policy. Just one question in the chat, and perhaps just to clarify, there was a slide there on the production of hydrogen, and there was a big blue circle over Rotherham, and there was a little bit of discussion as to what that meant. But if it's okay to just go back to that slide and just sort of clarify that would be useful.
So we mean, if we look at this one.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah. Paul, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just what was generating that that supply, I suppose.
In that case, it was a biomass plant called
Biomass plant at Templeburn, Blackburn Meadows.
Yeah. So Blackburn Meadows was one of them, and there's a CHP plant just in Rotherham as well, which is the other.
That's right.
Like I say, we kind of just, for the sake of just making a decision, we just assumed that all power would go into hydrogen. Obviously, that's unrealistic. But it gave us an upper bound for the amount that would be available. And I guess if you wanted specifics on that actual point, then it'd be best to look in the report, because we sort of go through where everything's come from.
No, that's useful. And we heard before around that sort of Sheffield-Rotherham corridor, sort of Meadowhall through towards Rotherham town centre, that it's sort of ripe for energy. So that would back that up.
Yeah, I mean, if you're planning kind of heat demand use, What we didn't look at as part of this study is the heat demand in the area. So that's part of a piece of ongoing work that we're doing for the MCA. But obviously, the decision that you're going to make between production of hydrogen, electricity, and kind of using a CHP is that interaction between what's the most efficient way of producing the residential heat or the local industrial heat that your CHP is currently trying to meet, and whether that's through a district heat network or whether it's through hydrogen. That's probably the decision that needs to be made, and that what influences that decision is probably what infrastructure is available already, and how that might evolve as part of kind of the wider decarbonisation effort.
Yeah, there's plans for a heat network to come from the Temple biomass, and the government funding's in place for that. So that's progressing.
Yeah. I think again, as part of another piece of work with the MCA, we might. I think that there's plans for us to kind of reach out to that project. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Saul. Thank you, Paul. There are other questions sort of coming in, but if people have sort of a burning question or any level of question, please feel free to post that. I suppose sort of saw one from my perspective, and having not been as close to this as some of the other research projects. I mean, would it be potentially possible to undertake a similar analysis of solar and PV and other types, essentially sort of providing sort of a master map of or a hybrid map of the potential for all types of renewables across South Yorkshire?
Yeah, I guess that we've got the foundations for that study already, right? So we've got the what's planned. So the planning database that we have here includes new solar development. They're not huge solar sites, so they're not the kind of gigawatt that we're seeing in the southeast of the country, but there's quite a lot of them. And the thing married up with that data is the connection, if I go a bit further down. So this capacity that we have on the network tells us actually where the grid would like us to connect any additional generation. So we've actually got quite a lot of local capacity that has to be tensioned against what's already planned. But a relatively simple extension of this piece of work is mapping against it where residential PV is already being generated and what outturn that has into the network. And then you could look at planning how much additional PV you'd want to deploy. That would obviously need to be tensioned against land use as it is, which I think would probably draw on one of the other projects. But we've kind of got the groundwork for doing all that analysis based on this work. Alex, I think.
Fabulous, thank you. Alex, yeah, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, John and Sol, and thanks for presenting the work. It's really interesting. I guess a key question for myself is kind of on the back of this research, what next then? I mean, obviously from a Doncaster point of view, you highlighted some of the opportunities around green hydrogen kind of production, linking in with some of the kind of major kind of planning applications for large scale solar, and obviously there's end users already in the borough as well. We have been doing some individual work around a hydrogen refueling hub in Doncaster, based again on large scale solar, but also our kind of connectivity to other areas, and the fact that we are an advantageous place for kind of logistics as well into that connectivity. So quite keen to know from this research kind of what are the next steps and how are they used for things like attracting investment and supporting the decarbonisation of existing industries.
Well, I guess I'll let John talk about using it for investment, but I guess as moving towards trying to provide a data-based decision-making database for the region. I think the next thing is heat. So kind of residential and industrial heat demands and how that overlays with some of the stuff that's been put here. I think that's kind of the core missing part of this data, right? So the thing that will use up some of the headroom in some of the transformers in the electricity grid is the dependence that we'll have on electrified heat. If industry moves to electrified heat, then again that will take up some of the capacity which we have available. So this is kind of very much a start. I think when we layer on heat onto that, then we kind of have a base level from which you can start planning. And I think, I mean, what was interesting to me, and I kind of probably overemphasized it, is I found it really interesting that we do have those kind of 3 clusters, and it was interesting that Doncaster was more kind of spread out than the Sheffield or up near Barnsley, and I think that probably means that you do have more options. It's more difficult to deploy a kind of mini cluster because everything's a bit further apart, but it probably means that you also have more decision-making capacity. I say that without having thought about it too much in detail, but I think that's probably the case, that if you're looking at deploying local infrastructure for local decarbonisation clusters, then you probably want to look at Sheffield, Rotherham and Barnsley as kind of examples, and then consider Doncaster as a slightly separate thing. Richard, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Richard, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to say that it is about how everything's interconnected, which Sol's just sort of alluded to. What this piece of work is, as well as a piece of work in its own right, it is kind of us looking at whether there is value in a local area energy plan on a geospatial basis, which we think there is, which would look at not just this, but as Sol said, heat use and generation, the uptake of EV, what effect that will have. I see one of the questions in the chat is about, the use of hydrogen for transport. What we need to do, I think, is look at the situation we're in now, and then we can plot on a temporal basis how we might change to meet our 2040 target. So how change might be imposed upon us that we need to provide for, but also things we might want to be pushing for to meet a net zero target. And using this piece of work as an example, the best way seems to be by using data sets and overlaying them on maps. As Sol said, until you start to look at it on a map, you might not realize how things are. It sounds obvious when you say that, how things are laid out. Where, the fact that you could be, in fact, in Doncaster and Rotherham, but you might be nearer to each other than you would be to somewhere in the same borough. So as we start to look at it on that basis, we can see these clusters, and we can see what the impact of different interventions might have. If we need to electrify 620,000 homes, that will be a big demand on the grid. So will that impact on availability of electricity to generate hydrogen for industry and those kind of things? And the only way to do that really is to overlay all those data sets together. So that's all I want to say on that.
Thanks, Richard. Also, Alex, to comment on your sort of inward investment sort of challenge, very much so. So discussions that Richard and I have been having are that this needs to get in front of a wider audience. Really, I suppose we're starting with sort of policy academics, researchers, and others, but we believe that the information within here has a sort of a commercial interest, and yeah, would love to pick that up offline if possible. So in the chat had a question there around extra demand that could be generated if switching to rail or buses that are powered by hydrogen, and will this be eclipsed by industrial numbers or need adding in?
I think that needs adding in. So again, that's a piece of work that's ongoing. I think the interplay of that is between kind of for buses, for example, is an interplay between whether you electrify or whether you use hydrogen, and that's kind of an ongoing. That's a kind of decision which is made kind of throughout all of this stuff, and is probably likely on a case-by-case basis because they're very tightly linked, and the use profile of a given technology is key for the decision to go for electrified or for hydrogen. I think there's also a question on curtailment of generators, and again, that's a piece of work that we have done. It's not part of this, largely because our so if that's of interest, Andy, then I can kind of I can send you some more work that we've done, but the focus here was bringing together open data sets that you could access rather than using our predictions to kind of fill it out. But we have looked at curtailment on these generators, and obviously assuming that all of the energy goes into hydrogen is a massive simplification, and curtailment plays quite a big role in the economics of hydrogen. I would say that if the cost case for the business case for green hydrogen needs some work, and that's not a South Yorkshire thing. That's just a general UK economic thing, that the business case for green hydrogen is a difficult one. I think so. Nigel, can high heat industries be set up to use the heat to generate hydrogen as an intended byproduct of their primary activity? So yes, you can do that, and there's ongoing research looking at it. I mean, you could, if you have available high heat in industry, you can also produce much more highly efficient electrical generation of hydrogen. So I would, in a lot of cases, if you have high grade heat from steel, for example, there's a decision to be made between still using electrically generated hydrogen and reformation of some kind, because you get a much higher bump up in efficiency if you have high grade heat. Although the kind of electrolysis that you use is slightly different and is more akin to the technologies that you would use in if you were coupling with nuclear. So you'd be looking at kind of solid oxide electrolysis units rather than PEM cells, which are kind of assumed as the green hydrogen option. Yeah, I think that's the.
Thanks, Sol. Yes, yeah. I had also a question sort of asked of me. I suppose it sort of links back to the commercial application and sort of thinking sort of further ahead about financial costs, and so how we may sort of develop this. But I assume that there's quite a bit of research and work undertaken about financial costs of hydrogen production, and that for me sort of highlights a little bit of what is the role of the public sector in that, because yeah, clearly there are commercial operators looking at that, and yeah, the public sector can be part of moving that along or developing it. But yeah, are you aware of sort of research? Is that sort of quite a big area?
Yeah, I think that's so that I guess the fundamental problem with hydrogen is the chicken and egg, in that kind of in order for industry, as an example, to move to hydrogen, there needs to be there needs to be the amount of hydrogen available for that to work technologically, and similarly for people to make a large amount of hydrogen, there needs to be the customers to take it up. So I think that there's kind of quite a clear role for the public sector in producing that initial market, and in enabling the infrastructure to produce the economy. I think there's kind of generally wide discussion about where you want to use hydrogen, and I guess there's some strong work looking at dissuading people from thinking about using it as for residential heat decarbonization. So that's So that's I would say that's probably an ongoing discussion for academics to have. I think, but essentially, green hydrogen will be more expensive than people have assumed it will be, and that's just because of the capital required for the kit to generate it is still relatively high, and because we're at the beginning of this industry, it hasn't quite got itself going. We don't have this supply and demand driving down costs of production. Then we're kind of at the start with stuff which is actually quite expensive to deploy now, and without the customers. So we've got this circle, and at some point it will require squaring, and the people who will do that will be government, at either regional or central level.
Thanks, Sol. We will make no assumptions as to what level of government will make those decisions. Can I also ask? So someone's posted a link to the work produced by Arup in collaboration with a range of different bodies, including all of the local authorities within South Yorkshire ourselves, but also several private organisations around effectively establishing a hydrogen economy sort of locally. A big part of that is also highlights some of the skills needed within this industry, and I suppose we've talked about finance, but skill set and having the available sort of labour and expertise to unlock the potential for hydrogen. Is that something that you're aware of or are involved in?
Well, we've seen the ARUP report, and I guess the Northern Power Grid's future energy scenarios also goes into hydrogen and looks at the deployment of some of the other technologies. So I guess that I think there's lots of information out there that's accessible. I think it's how these things get pulled together. I think the point about skills is actually really important. It's not just important for hydrogen. I think it's important for other kind of decarbonisation technologies, so whether it's carbon capture or just down to having enough technicians to deploy the kind of level of heat pumps that we're going to need. I think that's a significant challenge, particularly at the rate that the UK wants to deploy that heat pump. So if we're going to get to 500,000 a year, we're going to need the technicians to do that, and currently that's not the case. I think the manufacture of these bits of technology is also and the supply chains is also an interesting point for South Yorkshire, in that I guess we have one of the world's leading companies in electrolysis, ITM Power. We've got the manufacturing skills, so can we do the same for heat pumps, for example, now that when that becomes a big thing and we need to produce those at the scale that we'll need them at. So I think while there are lots of challenges, there are also lots of opportunities, particularly for the region, given the skills that exist and the expertise in region. So if we do the level of thinking that we are doing, and that the actors around are doing, then I think we can the region can take good advantage of the different things that are coming its way.
Yes, yeah, no, I agree. I think the also the chicken and egg analogy also applies to training people in a wide range of low carbon technologies. Really, it's sort of is the demand there? We expect it, but often training providers, when they're putting together courses, need to sort of see outcomes and employment outcomes. So that's sometimes a challenge there. And I was also sort of reminded, as you said, they're sort of technician, often a technician level skills. So that's quite a wide definition, have been raised by several employer bodies, including the Science Council, Royal Academy of Engineering, etc., as being really important for our transition to net zero. And it's often sort of a bit of an undersold or under-focused area of skills provision, but changes afoot. And Will has posted in the chat there about some work that Sheffield Hallam's CRESA have done, looking at that low carbon supply chains and employment and skills sort of locally, and that's sort of something that is very much on the agenda for the combined authority and our skills team. I'm just conscious of time, so a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any urgent or burning questions, please post them. The alternative really is to take in the information from the website, which was posted on the chat. We'll post it again. What we'll do is we'll circulate the materials via email. What I also wanted to convey is our thanks to Sol and your academic team for producing the work and running through that very clearly, highlighting for me what is a very exciting place for partners to be in, and lots of opportunities to work through. So yeah, there's a virtual round of applause as we always do on this kind of thing. So thank you very much for that, Sol. And if people have further questions, please direct them to myself, Peter, at the University of Sheffield, and Sol, and we'll mop that up. But thank you very much for your time today, Sol and colleagues, and look forward to seeing you on the webinar soon.
Many thanks. Appreciate it.